As he was unsure what to do, nature decided for him. This is really too gross, Brian thought to himself as he glanced at the clock. It was 6 in the morning. Damn, I thought it was the middle of the night, he murmured. Standing there for about 5 minutes, he whispered to himself, Gee whiz, if I sit in this, I'm going to get a rash. Next, Brian carefully walked down the stairs and knocked on the door of Mrs. Alexander's office. Mrs. Alexander opened the door and greeted him warmly. Hello, honey, what is it? Without waiting for Brian to reply, Mrs. Alexander could tell what had happened. You made a stinky, she observed, seeing his embarrassed look. Then, in a soothing tone, she reassured him. Don't worry, I'll clean you up, we've got a big day ahead. She led him into her office, where she swiftly changed him into a clean diaper. She also dressed him in overalls and a light blue long-sleeve shirt. Hey, Brian, we need you to have breakfast real fast, we're going on a little trip, she explained as she set down a bowl of oatmeal in front of him. Eat up, Brian, we've got a big day ahead. Brian ate his oatmeal, though not much of it, as he was not a big fan. However, Mrs. Alexander didn't mind because she had planned a big day of activities. After breakfast, Mrs. Alexander instructed Brian to go into the living room. It was about 6 a.m., and she told him they would be leaving at 7 war. She packed their lunches, including 2 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for Brian and 2 grape juice boxes, while she prepared a veggie sandwich, a Diet Coke, and some low-fat popcorn for herself. Soon, she led Brian to the SUV, telling him they were going on a trip to the zoo. Surprised, Brian exclaimed, What the hell? Mrs. Alexander shushed him gently. Shush, little one, this is part of the experiment. I need to analyze your responses to the different animals before you take new medication. Hesitant, Brian looked at the blue pill in his hand. After thinking for a bit, he swallowed it with a little bit of water. Good, honey, Mrs. Alexander said encouragingly. They walked up to the car as the sun was still setting, and she added, Brian, you can take a nap on our way to the zoo. During the ride, Brian took about a 45-minute nap and woke up as they arrived at the zoo entrance. Dressed in suspenders, a long blue shirt, and a diaper, Brian and Mrs. Alexander, who was wearing a beautiful sundress, approached the ticket booth. Mrs. Alexander presented their tickets, excitedly saying, It's going to be a big day today, Brian. What's your favorite animal? Brian mumbled, I guess the lion. We'll see that last, she replied. The zoo visit started with the birds and aquarium before lunch. After lunch, they proceeded to the African exhibit, the zoo's largest. As they were leaving the aviary area and headed to the aquarium, Brian whispered embarrassingly, Oh no, I made a little mistake. Mrs. Alexander was understanding and quickly reassured him, Oh honey, that's okay, that's what we have you in a diaper for. She even had a key for them to use a special handicapped bathroom. For today, you are. She chuckled as she helped him change. After lunch at a beautiful outside picnic area next to a small lake, they discussed the difference between domestic and wild animals. When you have a dog or a cat, we keep them in an infantile state, Mrs. Alexander explained as Brian chewed on his sandwich. A dog, no matter how old it gets, will always have the mind of a puppy. A cat will always have the mind of a kitten. That's how we domesticate animals. As the day ended, they enjoyed the African exhibit until sunset. Back in the car, Mrs. Alexander secured Brian into his car seat and began to drive home, telling him she would make him a quick dinner before bedtime. That night, Brian had dinner of potato pie, and before bed, Mrs. Alexander decided a change would be a good idea. She came out holding a big, thick diaper, thicker than the one before, adorned with tons of baby designs. Brian protested, I'm not going to wear it. You can't make me wear that. He even began to yell and shout. Mrs. Alexander calmed him down immediately. Calm down, Brian, these are just better for nighttime. I'm sorry about the design, she explained. Don't you worry, I ordered some new ones with simple designs, she added with a slight chuckle. Brian lay there as she put the thick diaper on him. Mrs. Alexander explained that she was going to add something new to prevent a rash, a baby powder. As she sprinkled the powder all over him, the whole room filled with the scent of baby powder. The diaper was so thick that Brian waddled to the chair as Mrs. Alexander helped him put on his pajamas. Then she asked him if he wanted dessert. Embarrassed by the whole ordeal, Brian felt infantilized but nodded in agreement. Mrs. Alexander cheerily said, "If you want dessert, come downstairs," as she walked down the stairs. The diaper was so thick that as Brian walked out of his room and down the stairs, the crinkle of his diaper was audible with each step. He felt so infantilized and bulky in his movements that he was acutely aware of the thickness and texture of his new attire. Brian sat down to get his dessert, and even before he reached the table, he could still hear the crinkle. He barely noticed before, but now it was impossible not to be aware of how thick and bulky the diaper was. Mrs. Alexander brought him some frozen yogurt topped with chocolate syrup and sprinkles. She left the room as he ate. After finishing his dessert, Brian put his dish in the sink and laid in bed, his mind racing. What the hell did I get myself into with this experiment? Why did I agree to this, he thought to himself, trying to make sense of his feelings and the surreal experiences of the day. End of part 3.